Chapter 13. KHAT. A few key facts. KHAT is a leaf that grows in the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The active compound cathinone is a stimulant. KHAT is popular among Yemeni and Somali populations, particularly men. Fresh leaves are chewed and dried leaves can be made into tea. KHAT has a slow onset and is long-lasting as it can be chewed continuously. Some effects are those similar to a strong coffee: positive mood, sociability, feeling jittery, lower appetite, and insomnia. KHAT, Catha edulis, is a plant known by many names around the world, which grows in the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The leaves are bitter tasting and when chewed release cathinone and its metabolite caffeine, two stimulants. KHAT's legality varies across the world. It's not scheduled under the UN's Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, despite being classified by the World Health Organization as a drug of abuse in 1980. Some countries, such as the UK, much of the rest of Europe, a number of Middle Eastern countries, and China, have chosen to make KHAT a controlled substance. In other places, such as Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia, and a number of other East African countries, KHAT is legal. It's used in some cultures as part of a religious-type ceremony. The leader will use KHAT to induce a fuller spiritual connection. KHAT use is often a communal activity, and until the ban in 2014, it was popular among East African communities living in the UK. In those communities, it is predominantly consumed by men, who will meet up to consume KHAT and socialise. In some parts of the UK, there were KHAT cafes, particularly popular with Somali communities, while Yemeni communities in the UK would often use KHAT in private homes and social locations. KHAT is usually fresh when it's chewed, because the cathinone in the leaves quickly turns into the less potent caffeine if the leaves are left to sit. It's possible to make tea from dried KHAT, but it will be much less potent than fresh leaves. What are the short-term effects? To consume KHAT, fresh leaves are balled up into a wad which will be chewed by an individual for at least an hour. Over the course of a session, for want of a better word, on KHAT, usually a couple of wads will be chewed. Cathinone and its metabolite caffeine are mild stimulants, and intoxication on KHAT is broadly similar in magnitude to that you'd expect from a strong coffee, or a low dose of a stimulant like amphetamine. People who use KHAT report feeling increased well-being, including chattiness and a positive mood. It's these intoxication effects that make it popular in social settings. Like other stimulants, chewing KHAT can increase alertness, but can also make a person feel more jittery. It will increase heart rate and blood pressure, while it will suppress appetite, and it may impact on ability to sleep, similar to caffeine. Because it is chewed, KHAT intoxication has a slow onset, similar to chewing coca leaf. It's very hard to overdose on KHAT when consuming it in this way, as it's almost impossible to chew the amount of leaves required for a toxic dose. There's weak evidence that KHAT intoxication could slightly increase the risk of heart attack, probably due to it being a mild stimulant and increasing heart rate and blood pressure. However, the evidence base is very limited, and any increased risk is likely to be small. What are the longer-term effects? As with many substances discussed in this book, far less is known definitively about the longer-term impact of using KHAT. Although its use is legal in many countries around the world, KHAT is still nowhere near as widely used as, say, alcohol is in Europe and the USA. KHAT is often consumed in social settings where people might also be smoking tobacco and consuming sugary, fizzy drinks. This can make it harder to tease out whether any health problems seen in people who regularly use KHAT are due to the KHAT itself or to other aspects of their behaviour or environment. The populations who regularly use KHAT may also be individuals who find it hard to access health services, so this could also impact on their general health. For example, heavy KHAT use has been linked to respiratory problems, but only when users also smoke or spend time in smoky environments. As is the case with many other substances, people who use KHAT rarely do so without the use of any other substances, and the effects of them might interact. People who regularly use KHAT report a mild come-down after having used it, including mood swings and feeling grumpy and irritable. However, it's unclear whether regular KHAT use leads to tolerance. When people stop using KHAT after having used for a long time, they can report lethargy, mild depression, slight trembling, and some may experience recurring bad dreams. At the moment, there's little evidence to suggest that KHAT might be dependence forming. We can't conclude either way at present. Case studies have identified individuals who would be categorised as dependent on the substance, but whether this would hold at a population level is harder to say. It's important to highlight here again that individuals who use KHAT might be less likely to seek medical help if experiencing dependence, which could then mean that their problems are not recorded when prevalence information is collected, which could in turn make it seem like KHAT is less addictive than it actually is. In the UK, mental health services are less accessible for members of Black, Asian and minority ethnic or BAME communities than for their white counterparts, and KHAT is almost exclusively used by minority ethnic individuals. There's some evidence from animal studies, and some case reports in humans, of KHAT use being linked to liver problems. However, any association is far from clear. There have been cases where individuals have developed liver problems severe enough to require liver transplants, although only in small numbers. Unusually, although linked to KHAT use, these problems don't seem to be predicted by heaviness of use or other patterns that might be expected to predict physical health problems. As yet, it's not clear why some individuals seem particularly susceptible to liver damage from KHAT, or whether there are other factors at play that so far haven't been identified. KHAT use has been linked to oral cancers and oral health more generally, much like chewing tobacco. These suggestive findings are based on small studies, and while it seems there may be changes in the mucous membrane that lines the mouth of regular KHAT users, whether these changes increase the risk of oral cancers has not been proven. Interestingly, in the UK, dental problems are seen at higher rates in people who use KHAT, including cavities. However, dental problems of this kind are not seen in populations in the Yemen who use KHAT, which has led some to conclude that it is due to the use of sugary fizzy drinks to counteract the bitter taste of the leaves, a practice popular in the UK but not in Yemen. Comparing the relationship between KHAT and an outcome like tooth decay in two populations where other behaviours are different can be useful when trying to work out whether the cause might be the substance itself or something else, in this case sugary drinks. There have also been case reports of people experiencing acute psychotic episodes after using KHAT. This is something that is seen with a number of other psychostimulants, such as amphetamine, so perhaps this is not surprising. Clinicians have also reported that treatment of mental ill health can be complicated if an individual is also using KHAT, although these are just anecdotal reports. Analysis is complicated in the UK, as most people who chew KHAT are from an immigrant population with high levels of underlying trauma. These factors in themselves predispose people to higher rates of mental illness. Not only that, but the types of mental illness that are harder to treat effectively. As yet, there is no robust evidence to determine whether KHAT has a causal relationship on its own for mental illness. In populations with high levels of KHAT chewing in society, such as Yemen, there is not a higher rate of mental illness than other similar non-KHAT using populations. This suggests that at a broad population level, there is no association with KHAT use and mental illness. Myths and misconceptions. KHAT's not a drug, it's more like coffee or alcohol. Likening KHAT to coffee is not far off in terms of its intoxication effect, but as we know, caffeine and alcohol are drugs. And not considering a substance as a drug can be problematic if a person does get ill. For example, if a person presents to their doctor with liver problems and is asked, "Do you use drugs?" they might answer no, meaning the doctor will not consider the impact of KHAT on their liver and the problem might go undiagnosed while their condition deteriorates. So this is a myth. KHAT is the natural version of synthetic cathinones like mephedrone or MDPV. This is somewhat of a complicated one. Mephedrone and other related drugs are often called synthetic cathinones, but more technically they are methcathinones. All these drugs are stimulants, so their effects are certainly similar. But chewing KHAT means cathinone will be released slowly and at low concentration. Not only that, but because of the bulk of plant material chewed, it's very difficult to get quickly a high dose of cathinone or caffeine from KHAT. This is markedly different from consuming mephedrone or other synthetic cathinones as a powder, either swallowed or snorted, where doses are likely to be much higher and to reach the brain faster, meaning the intoxication experience will be different, but the risk of taking too much is also higher. So this is partly true. Does KHAT have any medical uses? KHAT is not used in Western medicine, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it ever has been. However, in Northeast Africa, it's used to treat a number of conditions, including depression and gastric ulcer. Its stimulant effects mean it is used to treat tiredness. It is also offered to individuals who are hungry but cannot access all the food they need, as it can suppress appetite. For this reason, it is also used to treat obesity. Focus on drugs and the brain. Throughout this book, there are lots of references to neurotransmitters, synapses, receptors, and other brain-related terms. It's quite well understood that psychoactive substances have an effect on the brain. But how? Neuroscience 101. Ignoring drugs for a moment, how do our brains work? To be slightly oversimplistic, they are kind of like very complex electrical circuits, or networks might be a better analogy. We each have billions of brain cells, neurons. Current estimates put the number at around 100 billion, and each is connected to billions of other neurons. Our brains are thought to have around 100 trillion connections. Electrical impulses occur when a neuron gets enough of a signal from the neurons around it, and then it'll pass that signal on to the other neurons surrounding it. The signal is passed across the synapse, the gap between neurons, by chemicals called neurotransmitters. Our brains are passing signals around like this all the time, even while we're asleep, controlling everything from our breathing to our dreaming. There are a number of different types of neurotransmitter that our brains use for different types of signal, and they're all molecules of different shapes. These neurotransmitters fit into differently shaped receptors on the surface of the next neuron in the chain. The analogy used is often like a key in a lock, and the next neuron will fire, passing the message along. Different neurotransmitters seem to be involved in different brain functions and different neuronal pathways around the brain. Dopamine is one often mentioned when talking about drugs. It's thought to be involved in reward and reinforcement of behaviours, motivation, and motor control. Serotonin is also linked to drug use. This neurotransmitter is linked to many high-level brain functions such as mood and memory, as well as other important behaviours like sleep and appetite. Some neurotransmitters do the opposite and inhibit the firing of the next neuron. GABA is an example of this kind of neurotransmitter. Other neurotransmitters you might have heard of include noradrenaline, histamine, and acetylcholine. What happens when psychoactive substances are added into the mix? Psychoactive substances tend to affect the brain in one of three ways, all of which involve neurotransmitters. Some drugs have a very similar molecular shape to certain natural endogenous neurotransmitters already present in our bodies or brains. DMT, for example, is a similarly shaped molecule to serotonin. Cannabinoids found in cannabis are a similar shape to the endocannabinoids we make. Opioids are similar to endorphins. In these cases, molecules of the drug can fit onto the receptors for these neurotransmitters, but here's where the key in the lock analogy slightly falls down. Because these molecules aren't exactly the same shape as our own neurotransmitters, the effects that they have on the receptors and neurons they bind to is slightly different. They don't just have the same effect as our own neurotransmitters, and so we experience a psychoactive effect. Other drugs change the levels of our existing neurotransmitters. Cocaine, amphetamine, and MDMA are examples of these types of drugs. They can have this effect in a couple of ways. They might lead to more neurotransmitter than usual being released into the synaptic cleft, the gap between two neurons. Or they might block the action of the mechanism that collects up and recycles the neurotransmitters that don't bind to receptors. Either way, the upshot is that the space between neurons ends up with more neurotransmitter present, which can lead to overstimulation or disruption of the usual communication pathways between neurons and a psychoactive effect.